I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Philip Tinari, who's been a longtime friend of ours, and he arrived in China in 2001, and I think I met him around 2005 or 6. Philip Tinari has served as director of Ullens Center for Contemporary Art, UCCA, the institution at the heart of Beijing's 798 Art District since late 2001. During his tenure, he has mounted more than 60 exhibitions and organized a wide range of public programs and development initiatives. His program has brought to China international figures including Robert Rauschenberg, Elmgreen and Dragset, Haegu Yang, William Kentridge, Terence Simon, and Tino Segal, and has tracked China's evolving art scene through retrospectives and survey exhibitions of artists including Zhao Bandi, Zheng Fangzhe, Liu Wei, Xu Zhen, Wang Keping, Wang Xingwei, Kan Xuan, and Gu Dexin, as well as exhibitions focused on emerging artists such as The New Normal, Art China, and 2017, On-Off China's Young Artists in Concept and Practice, 2013, and the ongoing exhibition series, New Directions. In 2001, he launched Leap, an internationally distributed bilingual art magazine published by Modern Media Group. He is a contributing editor of Art Forum and was founding editor of that magazine's online Chinese edition. He holds degrees from Duke and Harvard and is currently a Doctor of Philosophy candidate in art history at Oxford. Tinari is co-curator with Alexandra Monroe and Hu Hanru of the exhibition Art in China After 1989, Theater of the World, which opened at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in October 2017, and will travel to Bilbao and SF MoMA in 2018. With Phil, I'd like
Thank you so much for that introduction. Not to be like finicky, but in case people are really historian-minded back here, I arrived at UCCA in 2011, not 2001. Because UCCA hasn't even been around since 2001, so that would be a little bit. I arrived in China in 2001. Yeah. And anyway, good afternoon, and many thanks to the Hong Kong Art Gallery Association for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back in this building 5 years into its run, surrounded by so many friends and colleagues. Thank you especially to Katie for that very kind introduction, and to Meg for insisting that I do this. No one can say no to Meg. That's a lesson we all learn at some point in our careers in China. I wanted to talk today mainly about two projects that I've been working on over the past few years, and ultimately about how they connect. The first is an exhibition, Art in China After 1989, Theater of the World, which opened earlier this fall and remains on view through January 7th at the Guggenheim in New York. The second, and you see a first image there, the second is my work at UCCA, an institution founded in Beijing 10 years ago this month, and which just last month announced a new moment and a new model as our founders, Guy and Miriam Ullens, have realized a long-held dream of passing the house they built onto a new group and a new generation. There are many points of connections between these two strands of work, which is, apart from being the reason I am able to find any free time, the reason I have not yet been fired. Indeed, at the heart of both projects is a lingering and continuously urgent question: how to understand this thing called Chinese contemporary art, quote, in scare quotes, and how to present it in a way that is, one, sensitive to the conditions from which it emerges and relevant to wider audiences, both inside China and beyond. A question, I will add, that is made all the more fraught as political transitions occur, both in China and in countries like my own, the United States, that make rational thinking less and less a clear alternative. It is a question that many have been asking themselves for a very long time, or at least for the last 25 years, since in 1993, Hong Kong's own Johnson Chang and the Dutch curator Hans van Dyck organized two major shows, one originating here in Hong Kong, China's New Art post-1989, and the other, China Avant-Garde, in Berlin, which gave a first form to this nascent collective concept of Chinese contemporary art. It is a concept that has since been refined, redefined, challenged, and fought against in the ensuing years. And it is a concept that seems to become at once more and less relevant at the same time. When we set out to make the exhibition that became Art and China after 1989, and that we was originally Alexandra Monroe, who is the Samsung Senior Curator of Asian Art at the Guggenheim and has been there since 2006. We were later joined, later joined by Ho Han Ru, who is artistic director, a protagonist of the 1980s Chinese avant-garde, who has lived abroad in Paris first, later in San Francisco since 1989, 1990, and is currently actually director of a museum called Maxi in Rome. We knew we were walking into a minefield. On the one hand, there now exists a substantial and ever-growing bibliography in Chinese on this field, and we asked ourselves how we would relate to and contend with so much work and so much writing. And yet, on the other hand, an early history of seemingly definitive exhibitions, including the two I just mentioned, followed by efforts like Gao Minglu's Inside Out in 1998 and Wu Hong's Transience in 1999, were then followed by a long string of deteriorating market-driven articulations that had left many international audiences skeptical that there was really very much to be seen here. And yet, the more research we did, the more we felt that a specific and a specifically urgent set of conditions had shaped the work that we knew and loved. Was there then a way to present it in such a manner that it gave individual artists, groups, and exhibitions their due, while also conveying some sense that the creation of advanced art in China was far from being a market phenomenon, or as some confused American commentators, notably Jed Pearl, writing the week before the Olympics opened in 2008, a government-driven publicity ploy, but that it was rather a basically coherent avant-garde movement, replete with positions that were globally innovative and constantly relevant. Curating a show at the Guggenheim, I quickly learned, is an exercise in spatial relations. We drafted an initial proposal for internal review in late 2014, and once it had been approved, we immediately began a long process of what I have jokingly called playing dollhouse. Any work under consideration is made into a maquette, and hours upon hours are spent in the model room, which is not really a room because everyone has open plan offices now, moving maquettes up and down individual ramps into and out of what are called bays, up and down from web walls, in a series of 1 to 50 scale models of this notoriously difficult space. The exhibition designer Melanie Taylor quickly became a fourth curator, and Frank Lloyd Wright, an unsigned author of this, as of every show that transpires in this building since it opened in 1959. Aesthetically, our fundamental contradiction, to use a word from Chinese Marxist theory, was between an urge to do encyclopedic justice to the sprawling and chaotic nature of the scene versus a need of our long model sessions, which were conducted in sort of week-long periods over the ensuing 2.5 years. But something much more conceptual was going on as well. We had begun our thinking and our proposal with the idea of a kind of unified field theory of the Chinese contemporary, one that would begin at around the time of the Stars exhibition in the late 1970s and proceed to what we understood as the end of the avant-garde per se in around 2003. Of course, beginning in the 1970s, on the thinking that this is when, in the immediate aftermath of Mao's near 3-decade rule, new sensibilities and possibilities began to flourish, was not even so straightforward. And so we pushed the horizon backward, first toward other avant-garde and underground movements that began even before Mao's death, some of which were featured in a wonderful exhibition here a few years ago called Light Before Dawn. And then even further back to the avant-gardes of the 1920s and 1930s, some of whose protagonists lived and survived long enough to begin to influence a new generation in the late 70s at the dawn of opening and reform. This is fraught territory, rife for art historical exploration, that an institution like M+ will be very well positioned to explore in the required depth with its holdings. Microhistories and chains of influence abound, complicating the idea that contemporary art began on one single morning in 1979 when the stars hung their works on the fence outside the National Art Gallery, like so many theses on the cathedral door. From there, the trajectory weaves through a series of national debates over ideas like abstract beauty and the native soil, and through the eruptions of creativity now understood as the '85 New Wave, to the showdown back at the National Art Gallery exactly 10 years later, nearly 10 years later, known as the China Avant-Garde exhibition, which many people know as the moment when Xiaolu fired a gun into her own work, and the ensuing crackdown at Tiananmen a few months later. And so the more we attempted to negotiate this fluid boundary of when contemporary art might be said to begin in China, the more we realized two things. First, that there was no way to tell a story this long and complex, even in the considerable space that the show had been allotted, which is the entire rotunda, as you see there, and 2 tower galleries. So it's basically as big a show as one could do at the Guggenheim. And second, that in doing so, i.e. in starting from 1979, we would be beginning with this moment, which people who know Chinese history know is called reform and opening. And moving ahead, by doing this, we would be unwittingly reproducing what has since become a state-sanctioned narrative about the wisdom of the party in adjusting its mode of governance to new social and economic realities as the 80s arrived. The real rupture, we came to understand, happened not with a few speeches by Deng Xiaoping in 1978, or with the promulgation of a new constitution in 1979, or even with the death of Mao in 1976, but a decade later at the National Art Gallery, and a few months later at Tiananmen, and also in Berlin, where the wall fell, and in Paris, where an exhibition called Magicien de la Terre marketed itself as the first global contemporary art show. I'm, of course, talking about the year 1989. For society generally, as for art specifically, and Chinese art even more specifically, this year marked a breaking point where one system ended and another began, ambiguously but definitively to emerge. For us as curators, this was a liberating realization. We could do away with the urge to do justice to every movement and every moment along a long historical trajectory, and instead tell a story that began with this fissure, monumental and calamitous, and followed its aftermath through 2 of the most brutal, vital, destructive, and dynamic decades any society had ever experienced. We then ultimately decided to end our story in 2008 for reasons that are, again, obvious to anyone who knows China. The Olympic ceremony, which opened on August 8th, 2008 at 8 p.m., perhaps the most intentionally and widely awaited moment in China's modern history, the precise second at which it would announce its arrival into the family of powerful nations. That, combined with a range of global markers, including the financial crisis, Obama's election, and a shift from kind of internet 1.0 to social media, as well as a very practical desire not to come too close to the present for purposes of both historical clarity and not having to anger so many of our gallerist friends who represent so many great artists who emerged since that time. We decided to kind of call things off in 2008. And the subtitle of the exhibition, which comes from Huang Yongping's magisterial piece of 1993, Theater of the World, which I'll talk about in more detail soon, was a way of kind of inflecting this historical periodization with some sense of the basic condition that we were trying to point to throughout that whole period. And so this was the sort of opening piece in a space called the High Gallery, about which more to come. We decided to break this story into 6 sections, again, partially mandated by the logic of the building. After conveying, and you see actually another piece at the very beginning, which is a map commissioned from the artist Qiu Zhijie, which actually traces sort of the historical evolution of this entire period. It's an incredible image, and you can find it widely online. But he's essentially mapped the progress of art history in China between the 70s and today along this river, which flows into the sea of the Cold War, the Cool War, which is now, and the whirlpool of fake news. In the background, you have major changes in sort of Chinese ideology. So you begin with Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics and move onward to the China dream, Deng and Xi's main ideas. And then along the bottom, you actually have what's going on kind of in the global firmament. So from Thatcher all the way to where we are today. And then in that vast middle ground, every obscure, short-lived art space, exhibition, every piece that was in the exhibition, and all kinds of interesting imagined connections and real connections among and between them. And this is a series that Joe has been working on for many, many years that people may be familiar with. So that was sort of the opening of the sort of overture into the exhibition, which then moves ahead into a section that speaks to 1989 as the point of departure and the reason why it was chosen. We tried to do justice to this ambiguous moment through a number of different kinds of pieces, including something like these plastics by Gu Dexin, which were actually shown in the China Avant-Garde show in 1989. He was then one of the 3 Chinese artists, along with Huang Yongping, who we just saw, and Yang Jieqiang, to participate in Magicien de la Terre in Paris. But also including something like, on this monitor, I didn't have an image of the Xiaolu gunshot performance on rotation, but there were actually 7 or 8 performances that happened during the 89 show, China Avant-Garde, in Beijing in February of 1989. And the idea of performance was the main bone of contention between the various factions of the curatorial collective, some of whom had agreed that there would be no performance because that was kind of the line set by the organizers. So we've focused on, this is actually Li Shan washing his feet in a bowl with multiple images of Ronald Reagan on it. And then behind there you see actually this piece, Wang Xingwei's New Beijing, this painting at left, which actually was realized in 2001, shortly after Beijing was awarded the Summer Olympics, and which is based it's from M+'s collection, actually. And it's based on a news photograph by H.S. Liu, one of the, not the most famous image of Tiananmen, obviously, because we know that's the Tank Man, but one of the next 2 or 3 of students kind of harnessing a flatbed tricycle to take wounded protesters to the hospital. And Xingwei has replaced them with emperor penguins, animals which have absolutely no significance in the Chinese bestiary, coming as they do from the South Pole. Not the first animals to be wounded in this exhibition. So as you can kind of see what was happening. I mean, we're trying to gesture at this moment through a constellation of works from different moments, but talking about a time. And you see actually in the foreground there an archival vitrine full of all kinds of materials about that historical moment. From here, we move forward by going backward into the more conceptual roots of art in the 1980s. This section was called New Measurement, Analyzing the Situation. And it looked at the practices of artists like, you can see Wang Guangyi, Zhang Peili, Geng Jianyi, Wang Jianwei, Wu Shanzhuan, the New Measurement Group, and even people like Ding Yi and Qiu Zhijie as varieties of a similar impulse to intervene through categorization, repetition, documentation, and rule-based play. We were arguing here for a continuity between the experiments of the heady 1980s and the use of these same strategies to encounter and engage with a changed world in the aftermath of the upheavals of 1989. And we were arguing actually against a very standard interpretation of contemporary art history in China, where those more idealistic 1980s experiments, which are seen to have happened at a time before there was an avid market or much international interest or participation, suddenly gave way to essentially the art that you see in the China Club, a place that you've all been, i.e. political pop and cynical realism, schools that were coined in those 1993 exhibitions and which quickly, 15 years later, became enshrined as kind of a market-driven canon. So the choice of that gridded image of Mao, which you see in kind of at the far right of this by Wang Guangyi from 1988, was intentional. This is a work that plays on a dissection of an image rather than the works which grew out of this series in 1991 under the title Great Criticism, where socialist imagery is directly juxtaposed with capitalist logos. So this was a rather monochromatic and sort of serial ramp. And you had pieces also like Geng Jianyi's Forms and Certificates, which was a piece he did in 1988 in the lead up to something called the Huangshan meeting, the Yellow Mountain meeting, which was the conference at which the 89 show was planned, where he circulated this questionnaire to all the leading artists and critics of the time and asked them to fill it in. And only as they did, they realized it was actually an absurdist questionnaire that asked things like, have you ever at any time had any deviant thoughts? And those who filled it in were ultimately given a certificate. You see things like Zhang Peili's painting of a glove paired with this performance that he did where he was mailing rubber gloves at the height of a hepatitis epidemic in Hangzhou to students at the Central Academy. And you see something like Wu Shanzhuan's kind of goofy manifesto, Today No Water, which is an exploration into philosophy and history and an ideology in the form of a kind of essentially a graphic novel that is 800 pages long and counting. And then from there into things like Ding Yi's monochromatic painting, which is based on the repeated making of a single mark, a vertical cross. And finally to a piece like Qiu Zhijie's writing the Orchid Pavilion preface 1,000 times, where he does exactly that, leaving a kind of monochrome painting at the end and foreshadowing a future in which this young agitator would channel the conceptual impulse of the 1980s generation into an entirely new kind of art making. From here, we tacked and tackled the thorny idea of realism. And this section was called 5 Hours. Each section is named after a piece in the show. Capitalism, Urbanism, Realism. And we were looking at the notion of how artists engaged with the cataclysmic transformations taking place in the wake, not of 1989, but of actually Deng Xiaoping's trip south in 1992 when he announced the deepening of reform, looking also at how the architecture of artistic education, which was still modeled on the pedagogies of Soviet realism, left artists with a consistent impulse to document the conditions around them in a way that might be sympathetic with the plight of the ordinary individual. This painting here is instructive by Zhao Bandi. It's a portrait of a man, an anonymous friend. It's called Young Zhang. And he's essentially sitting on a bed, smoking a cigarette and trying to wonder what he's going to do with his life, a question that people were sort of asking themselves more or less for the first time as the economy opened and suddenly, jobs were no longer assigned and possibilities opened up. So there was a certain anomie that accompanied this new sense of flexibility and freedom. So this impulse to use realism for the purposes of sort of exalting the everyday, we find in that work, but also in pieces by Liu Xiaodong at right, Yu Hong at left, at the far side of that image, Zhang Xiaogang and Zheng Fanzhi, but also in, missed an image. Okay. In things like the photographs of Liu Zheng, who was using, inspired by Robert Frank, was using photography to document the margins of Chinese society. We then devoted several bays to the Big Tail Elephant, a confederation of 4 artists, Xu Tan, Lin Yilin, and the late Liang Juhui and Chen Xiaoxiong, which emerged from the grit of Guangzhou in the early 90s and made art by directly participating in the city. This is Chen Xiaoxiong's 5 Hours, in which he creates this device kind of intentionally designed to waste electricity, which he then measures using a device that's hung around his neck and records it as the time goes on over these 5 hours, how many kilowatt hours are being consumed. To see these expressions, to see these as expressions of the same moment, and to add this, i.e. the same moment as this realist painting. So to look at the big elephant and the painters together, and to kind of connect them, using the fulcrum of this, which is a research project initiated by Rem Koolhaas and his students into the urban condition of the Pearl River Delta at exactly this moment, but without knowledge of what the big-tailed elephant were doing, for example, is among the more radical positions taken by the show. Anyway, so you see also, this is a piece by Xu Tan called Made in China, which is actually really lovely talk of the town piece for anyone who reads The New Yorker, about where he sort of just lined up all these everyday objects and interspersed it with videos that were made in the kind of new urban interstices of Guangzhou in the early 90s. So the next section, section 4, Uncertain Pleasure, Acts of Sensation, looked at several dynamics at once, and that once was the mid to late 1990s. Artistically, this is the place where things get somewhat radical, as artists who have nothing begin to use their bodies, and sometimes those of others and even other species, to channel their investigations into existence. Art historically, this is the moment where transnational transmission becomes important, as artists who left China begin to come back permanently or temporarily, and expanded, albeit still not fluid, channels of information offer access to new ideas and new images. So this is a piece that's quite typical of this period. This is an installation by Wang Gongxin called The Sky of Brooklyn. Actually, this is called The Sky of Beijing. He originally realized this piece in his courtyard apartment in Beijing shortly after moving back there after many years in New York in the 90s. And for the exhibition, we actually redid this piece, but sort of conceptually, it no longer made sense to have the footage in the well be of the sky in Brooklyn, because that's just the subway right away. So instead, we replaced it with footage, or he replaced it with footage of the sky above his home in Beijing on what looks like a very blue day. In any case, this section broke down into roughly 3 units. The first of which was centered around the Black Cover Book, a publication which Xubing and Ai Weiwei edited in 1994, and to the ecology of young artists, mostly in Beijing, whose work it galvanized, culminating in what you see here, which are the performances of the East Village artists, again in 1994, a moment that's relatively well known in this history, which we tried to contextualize. The second is and that's a very famous piece, but we understand that it's first published actually in the White Cover Book in 1995, and we were interested in kind of the logics of the ways in which Ai Weiwei was actually a seminal figure in creating a community of young artists, still local to Beijing, but who kind of envisioned themselves as part of a larger international community. The second sort of subsection of this larger section focuses, it's a more academic story centered on the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou, where artists from around China gathered in 1996 for an exhibition and a conference called Image and Phenomenon, which was the first concerted effort to understand the relatively new medium of video art and the place it might occupy in China, with reference to figures including Bruce Nauman, Bill Viola, and Nam June Paik. And these are a number of pieces that were produced and shown in that first exhibition. So we see a piece by Cho Jujie, which is a kind of feedback loop, filming the viewer, but sort of putting them in the middle of kind of a funereal wreath. And then Zhang Pei Li's Uncertain Pleasure, from which the section takes its name, in which you see hands scratching various body parts on monitors that are on the floor. The final subsection here was about the cluster of artists who coalesced around a series of exhibitions called Post-Sense Sensibility in the very late 90s, curated by Chiu Zhijie and Wu Meichun starting in 1999, and an implicit conversation with similarly radical and visceral work being made by the YBAs in London at around the same time. And you see actually in the foreground this series of plastic tanks which have been stir-fried in sort of a tempura batter, which was a piece by Zheng Guogu that he actually realized on site in the first of the post-sense sensibility exhibitions, which happened in a basement of a residential building in northern Beijing in January of 1999. And this formation of artists has become really the core of the generation that's kind of now in its 40s and almost into its 50s, but who were really the transitional generation that were educated after 1989 and then kind of come to function and exist in this new world of China after 2000. And I can tell you there are a lot of conservation issues related to a museum having to stir-fry tanks. It was ultimately done, I think, off-site in New Jersey somewhere. And the question is, at what point did they become art? So the fifth section was entitled Otherwhere, Travels in the In-Between. And for this, we zoomed out to look at a dynamic that shapes the entire period of the show, movement, travel, resettlement, and negotiation with the global art world. Keeping in mind that the global art world itself was only really coming into focus during this period of the 1990s. So this is one of the side galleries where you're able to present larger installations, and that's at the center is a piece by Chen Zhen, which he made on the commission of an art center in Kita, Kyushu in Japan. A bamboo forest kind of hung with everyday objects and wooden Buddhas upside down. But really where this section began was with two of the more heartfelt and organic exhibitions of this era of encounter, which began with 1989. Fei Dao's Chine de Montpellier, which took place in the tiny French village of Poirier in Provence in the summer of 1990. And then Exceptional Passage, which is just a literal translation of the Japanese word feichanko, which just means emergency exit, which happened in Fukuoka the following year. And from here, so you had, essentially a reconstitution of what had been the 80s avant-garde through these small exhibitions that were happening more or less organically in cities around cities around the world in the early 1990s. But at the same time, you had artists in China who were poking fun at the ways that their creations were being marshaled into new discourses of multiculturalism and globalization, often without their willing participation. Pieces like Yen Lei's Are You in the Exhibition Going to Germany, which you see it's that small painting of a fencer with this slogan above it. He's, of course, referring to Documenta. And Zhou Tiahai's right, There Came a Mr. Solomon to China, which is an extended riff on the critic Andrew Solomon, a critic and journalist and kind of TED Talk extraordinaire. Andrew Solomon, he's also a psychologist and an author who came in 1993 and wrote this extended profile of the Chinese art scene for the New York Times Magazine. And so Tiahai's collage here sort of centers on his Solomon's author photo and has all these kind of poetic colophons and citations sort of poking fun at the esteem in which he was held by the scene. But also pieces like this, which is called Wujie, just in Pinyin by Xu Bing and Ai Weiwei, Wu Street, which took a pile of paintings that had been found on a New York trash heap and turned them into a sensation by publishing them in a Chinese art magazine, along with a translated text of an essay about a completely different group of paintings. So these artists were asking valid questions about how cultural capital is accrued and who has the power to assign it. We ended this section with actually two wonderful pieces. One is Huang Yongping's Bat Project, this is a maquette that kind of recounts his extended multi-year struggle to create a life-size replica of the U.S. spy plane that went down over Hainan Island in 2001, being censored at essentially every turn as different forces conspired against showing this work, that not just the Chinese government. And then Yang Fudong's A Strange Paradise, which people might be reminded was actually commissioned by Documenta in 2002, the same exhibition that Yen Lei earlier in the show, earlier on down the ramp, parodies, also with a piece in which he issued a fake invitation letter to 100 artists in 1997 asking them to go to Documenta. So we're essentially trying to argue that, while there were these valid critiques being made by these artists, there were also ways in which this international system was starting to catalyze new production and new ways of working among the artists. And then we get to this final section of the exhibition, and this top level of the Guggenheim, which you may wish to know, was originally designed actually as office and storage space. That's why the bays are much deeper and much wider. This section is looking at the period after 2000, and at a specific impulse, which we thought was indicative of the ways in which the progressive avant-garde sensibility of these artists reinvigorated itself as China, which had recently entered the WTO and was looking towards a more global future, moved into yet another phase of its development. This section is called Whose Utopia? Alternatives and Activism, circa 2008. Whose Utopia, of course, a piece by the artist Cao Fei, in which she goes into an Osram light bulb factory in Foshan and asks the workers to sort of act out their fantasies of their own future as it was commissioned by Siemens in 2006. This section looked at a string of organized projects which attempt to find new ways for artists to convene, to intervene, and to participate. These ranged from the Long March project, which began life as a curatorial journey following the route of Mao's trek through China in the 1930s. It was kind of one of the founding. It's like, if you know American history, it's kind of like Washington's winter at Valley Forge to the Red Army. But Ulens is as the basis of an art project and ultimately the name for a gallery. To the exhibitions organized in Shanghai under the auspices of the BizArt Center, to Oning's rural retreat in Anhui in a town called Bishan, where he sort of convened a lot of intellectuals and artists in the countryside to think about rural reconstruction, and onward to projects like Cao Fei's R&B City, which was a virtual polity on the online platform of Second Life, or Ai Weiwei's upbeat organization of 1,000 Chinese visitors to go to Kassel for Documenta in 2007, followed by a more tragic organizational project to collect the names of children killed in the Sichuan earthquake during the following year. These projects show how artists have used their positions to do things that might not otherwise be done. And the subtext to these projects was the monumentality of the Olympics, which were productively mocked by the collective Xijing men, which unfortunately I don't have an image of. Should have asked Meg, sorry. Whose piece Xijing Olympics, it was an extended performance that happened actually during the Olympics, where the three artists, Chen Xiaoxiong, Tsuyoshi Ozawa, and Kim Hong-suk from China, Japan, and Korea, respectively, perform a series of silly games. And they, part of the installation for this exhibition had been a series of extended bleachers built into the gallery, and we kind of riffed on this idea of the bleachers for this whole sixth section. So you sort of see these running throughout the space, which is something that had never actually happened before at the Guggenheim. That's Ai Weiwei's pieces and others down ramp. So these 6 sections were followed by what we took to calling the coda, a more straightforward room, a rectangular, non-curving room, at the very end of the show, in which were installed just 3 works. The most important of these was a set of panels by the artist Gu Dexin, who made the plastics, those burnt plastics we saw at the very beginning of the show, in which a series of 11 sentences repeats itself ad infinitum in the same red Songti font that one sees on the vertical signs outside of government office buildings. And these sentences say again and again things like, we have killed people, we have beaten people blind, we have killed children, we have eaten children, and on and on and on. It's sort of evoking, the ultimate Chinese modernist paranoia, as we see in Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman, that the people around you are cannibals. The initial idea was to pair these panels, which were originally shown at Galleria Continua in Beijing in the 798 Art District, in May and June of 2009, not incidentally the 20th anniversary of the Tiananmen incident, with an installation by the artists Sun Yuan and Peng Yu, which originally appeared at exactly the same time next door in a gallery called Tang Contemporary, titled Freedom, and involving a fire hose that forcefully and periodically sprays water at the internal walls of the sealed-off gallery, its direction guided by nothing other than the force of the water coming out of it. Multiple attempts to reconfigure that piece for the spatial and conservation constraints of a New York museum were not successful, which is when we decided to show another piece, which was a 2003 video entitled Dogs That Cannot Touch Each Other, in which documenting a performance that happened at the Today Art Museum in 2003 during the first Beijing Biennial, in which 4 pairs of pit bulls with their trainers behind them were harnessed to facing pairs of non-motorized treadmills and proceeded to run towards each other restrained for 3 7-minute intervals. And this is, of course, where the story of presenting 2 decades of art from China turns into an entirely different kind of story about presenting 2 decades of art from China in an America that is very much unsure of itself and its position, and one that is saddled with an information culture, fake news, in which quick transmission of partial information creates circumstances for immediate and angry mobilization. So this video, which you see here ultimately represented by itself with a screen that is showing only the title frame of the video, was one of 3 pieces involving animals, the other 2 being Xu Bing's Case Study in Transference, an iconic performance from 1994 in which he paired 2 pigs, one of whom was stamped with his nonsense characters that he pioneered for the Book from the Sky in 1989, the other stamped with gibberish kind of Roman nonsensical characters and left them to mate. And the third being the artitular piece, Huang Yongping's Theater of the World, which is a panopticon-style cage shaped like a turtle, in which insects and amphibians and reptiles of various species kind of vie for survival. What these pieces had in common is that they were all mentioned and, in fact, illustrated in a very long article by the New York Times Beijing bureau chief Jane Perlez, which ran on September 20th. The exhibition opened on October 6th. And so within a few hours of this piece running, sort of opposition to this piece of the article running, opposition starts to mobilize among first the Pitbull community and then sort of branches outward to encompass people like Ricky Gervais, at which point a Change.org petition is launched that within less than a week has 800,000 signatures, which we like to note is more than double the number of signatures on the petition to try the neo-Nazi who killed the woman in Charlottesville had received. Among the critiques being made by people who took to calling us really, really nasty things on Twitter and on Instagram, one of the more interesting was the idea, because at this point you can't actually debate or legislate the factual issues around these pieces, nor would you really want to argue with the mob. But my essentially favorite piece of the whole thing was those who thought that we were, because of course, as the title states, the dogs actually do not touch each other. So no actual contact or violence actually ensues. But we were actually propagating a stereotype that pit bulls are violent. So essentially what you have is identity politics for dogs, which is essentially what America needs right now. So the point being, the museum ends up being put in a very, very difficult situation where it either reacts to the demands of the protesters in some way or shuts them down entirely and has to start to think about things like the safety of its guards and works on view and visitors in a country where automatic firearms are completely legal. And a decision was ultimately made to alter the presentation of these works, essentially to remove them from view. But this is where things get interesting because, of course, what then happens is immediately the same newspaper that creates the situation and reports on the protests, then accuses the Museum of censorship. And what actually is impossible to do is convey with any sense of depth or complexity what artists actually do in these situations, which is think through them and come up with ideas about how to process them. So this was Sunyeon and Pengyu's statement in the end, was just to simply leave the video present, although kind of eternally paused. And then you had, related to the Hwang Yongping piece, you'll see in the back, in a vitrine, a paper bag, which is actually an Air France air sickness bag, on which he wrote an extended essay about this situation, and in fact about the history of this piece, which has been censored for more or less the same reasons in 1994 in Paris when it was shown at the Pompidou, and again in 2007 at the end of a long international tour when it was shown at the Vancouver Art Gallery. In these various cases, the solution was generally to remove the animals and leave the sculpture on view, which, if you noticed in that very first image, is exactly what we did for the final presentation. Xu Bing sort of had the hardest time of all because there was not a great way to. I mean, his piece essentially got caught in the crossfire because this is a piece that's been exhibited again and again and again, really without incident. But because the parameters of this petition were based on the pieces that had been mentioned in the article, there was no way to remove some without all and have any hope of sort of quelling the situation. So his decision was to show the empty video screen. There should have been a still image mounted next to it in a frame, and then you see to the right, again, a statement that he drafted talking about his reaction to what had happened, actually playing on a famous anecdote about, you're not a fish, how do you know the joy of fishes? So anyway, that's where the story of this exhibition for the moment ends, and where I think we can sort of transition to talking a bit more about, in the sort of limited time we have left, because I think I can go for, a few more minutes, like five or 10? Okay. What it means to kind of run an art institution in China, where one is subject to a whole other set of pressures and constraints, but where one is also trying to kind of create new space for artists and publics to come together in different ways. So I just thought I would briefly show just a little video that we made for the 10th anniversary of UCCA, which we celebrated just last week, which gives you just a little bit of a sense of sort of the scope of the project and what we do.
您期待什么样的美术馆在中国？您期待什么样的美术馆？
什么样的美术馆？资金比较足的一个美术馆，
非盈利的，
不完全模式扒过来的那种，
能够长久的美术馆，
一个先锋的角色。
什么美术馆都需要。
我现在都晕了，就以前你很明确的，因为有美术馆，就只有这几个地方，
可以给任何一种艺术实现的一种场地。
我觉得只要看到的方向，就说不要去吹毛求疵的去探讨一些具体问题上，
能看到一些普通观众，就圈外的人，能接入美术馆看展览。
最早去 UCCA 一定是开馆之前就去了。展览第一次是85新潮的展览，由费大为来做的。
那时候正好赶上是中国的艺术品市场特别火热的时候，而尤伦斯这个机构坚持了那个我们所认同的当代艺术的一些基本的伦理，或者是基本的价值观。
做机构，我觉得它会涉及到未来。尤伦斯作为一个品牌，它开始进入了这个从过去、现在、未来3块同时入手的这么一个模式。
它是把一个完整的一个美术馆的体系搬到中国来了，就有非常明确的一个价值判断。
它有自己比较明确的方向，它仍然是以中国当代艺术为主的。
就你可以发挥你的想象，在这儿施展你所有的想做到的一切吧。
他们基本上做到了支持他们所认为的纯粹的 艺术。
UCCA 呢，其实这个做的很多展览的质量还是很高的。
他们这么多年来的贡献也是有目共睹，做了很多非常优秀的展览。
他确实树立了很好的一个榜样，这么多年对中国当代艺术起到了非常大的推动作用。
大家都在为某种心中的目标在工作啊，那个工作就是在中国最高的一个标准上做最好的展览。
它其实在某种角度上承担了很多试错的功能，让很多人可能还没有反应过来的时候，他们已经做了。
2年前加入尤伦斯的
，2012年的夏天，来到了这里。
2008年参加了青年批评家计划，
已经拿了差不多3年半了。
当会员吧，我整整当了8年。
加入尤伦斯之前，我算是尤伦斯的一个小粉丝。
Actually, when I first arrived, UCCA was one of the first museums I ever went to. 2009年4月8号。我自己都感觉似乎尤伦斯是我自己身体的一部分了。
2011年的9月正式加入到 UCCA 的团队的。
在尤伦斯工作感受最深入的就是这个团队，各方面都非常的优秀，非常多优秀的人。
过去的10年，其实从我加入尤伦斯，可能就一直是我们在不断的探索、不断的发展。那现在的话，我觉得方向性更明确了。这2年里，我觉得让我感触最深的是尤伦斯人的精神，这种精神一直激励和鼓励着我，然后让我觉得无论在何时何地，都为成为尤伦斯人而感到骄傲和自豪。
尤伦斯当代艺术中心其实是中国一个非常特殊的时代的产物，可能全世界就是目光放到了中国，但是就是还不知道具体在期待什么。那么在这10年，其实发生了巨大的变化。我们现在所面临的世界可能比原来的还要更复杂。所以希望在未来的这10年，我们可以继续容纳很多不同的思想，汇集很多不同的观点，一切可以做得更好。
祝福尤伦斯，也希望这种精神感染着每一个对艺术执着的人，
跟尤伦斯共同成长。
再来10周年，
我们一个10年接着另一个10年，再接着下一个10年。
祝福那个 UCC 生日快乐！然后呢，他永远也不知道我多喜欢他。
越来越多小朋友来这儿，越来越多的。
让更多的人去知道当代艺术，让更多的人爱上当代艺术，
把我们深爱的艺术传播给更多的人。
我希望我们儿童教育这边可以有500个孩子。
希望以后尤伦斯能够展出继续高水平的作品吧。
尤伦斯可以在这个道路上越走越远，越走越好。尤伦斯在过去好的基础上呢，当然更好，让我们有一个非常愿意去的地方。
现在真是一个历史的时刻，我们祝福尤伦斯美术馆奔向未来，
完成自己的初衷，不要改变，从头到尾。
我希望尤伦斯继续更生猛，
我希望在下面的10年，尤伦斯可以触及到更多的人。Okay, there you go. You want to give us money? No, I actually think we're sort of almost out of time, but I just did want to explain briefly, kind of the interesting situation we now find ourselves in, and the extremely exciting one after these first 10 years of, being essentially founded by a couple of Belgian collectors who had a very specific involvement with this scene through acquiring work. This is something that changed over the years as they deaccessioned much of this work, which was never actually under our direct management as the center, to this new moment where they have essentially retired from the project, and it's been now taken over by a new group of Chinese, mainly, stakeholders and supporters. And we're finally able to think about things like a 10-year plan for what we would like the place to become. Something that's never easy in China, where things change quite rapidly and quite often. So anyway, I'm quite excited to be sort of embarking on this new period of collaboration with this new group. And hopefully to being able to make more and more interesting exhibitions, to sort of improve the space, to broaden the program. And actually, because we're finally able to set up a proper nonprofit auditable mechanism, first here in Hong Kong, but soon also in mainland China and potentially elsewhere as well, to be able to expand the contribution that we make, the ways in which we engage with viewers, and the kinds of research we produce and the kinds of services we are able to provide. So anyway, I hope anyone who's coming through Beijing will have a chance to come check us out. We have lots of exhibitions every year. We're in a bit of a renovation moment right now, and from about March of next year, there will be, again, a very full and ample program of exhibitions. There's always plenty of public programs going on. And anyway, I hope we're able to continue to serve our city and our constituency for many more years to come. So anyway, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Yeah, I'm happy to take questions, sure.
Thank you. Phil, we know you, this time the Guggenheim, the show was as two guest curator and Maru and two assistant curator. May I know how do you divide the job and how you work together and how often you catch up to come up with the idea for the whole plan?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically, we've talked a lot about it as kind of a workshop model. So it wasn't like in some of these kind of joint curatorial situations where people divide and conquer and each one's responsible for a different section. I mean, of course, we each have artists and works that we're closer to and that we know better, but it all sort of emerged through a process of conversation, really. And again, like with actually quite a lot of recourse to the physical models of the space and thinking specifically about how to tell a story and structure an argument in those specific confines.
Challenges of can you talk about the challenges of running a gallery and hosting exhibitions in China, in particular when the content may be a little bit political?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a key issue. I guess it was interesting for me working on this big exhibition in America to realize that, nowhere is actually any better than anywhere else at this point, unfortunately. But no, I mean, it's interesting how that happens. There are different moments where it can. The sort of most frustrating and most absolute is when you're importing work to China. And at that point, there's a very strict process of scrutiny that runs through the Bureau of Culture. And that's where it's not even the power to say no, it's the power sort of not to say yes and issue the permit to import work. And if you don't have that, then you can't show that work, and you won't necessarily get a straight answer about why you did or didn't get it. Interestingly, Beijing, I don't know how much of this I should say like on tape and such, but Beijing is in some ways better than Shanghai in that this sort of, let's just say, there's less kind of direct scrutiny of what's on, once things are in the country, there's less direct scrutiny of what's on your walls than one might think. And there are always kind of gray areas and ways to make, as we ended up doing in the Guggenheim show, to sort of make the invisible visible. When we did the Rauschenberg show, we had, it was 197 panels that make up the Quarter Mile painting. And 2 of them were restricted from import, censored. One because it had an image. Actually, it was it's a photo. It's a massive piece, but one because it had an image of Mao, and one because it had an image of actually a Tibetan woman in a cloak with a swastika on the back, which is ironic because we all know the origin of that symbol. So we just left the space where those panels would have been, and it becomes very obvious to people who are told that sometimes by our docents or who know on their own, sort of what happened. So I think there's a responsibility to kind of make clear what's led to, the circumstances behind a particular decision. And then there are ways to sort of cultivate the people who you are working with. For example, our area is under the jurisdiction of a management committee, which sits under Chaoyang government, which is the district of Beijing we live in. And there are ways in which, we can help them with things that are important to them, and then they help us with things that are important to us. And, you sort of are just back into a much more transactional, negotiated kind of working relationship.
Okay. Just back on the topic is what he just asked, but you were in the space for 10 years. Has that?
I actually haven't. I've run it for 6. So,
sorry.
Yeah.
But has that, when you were there, has that changed in terms of the people coming in, artworks getting censored, things like that?
It will be very interesting to see what now happens, because on the one hand, we shouldn't be surprised if things start to get significantly more difficult. On the other, if you look at the long arc, an awful lot of progress has been made. And thinking also about, I don't know, really specific relationships that kind of determine the scope of space that's available to contemporary art in China. One of them, Jiang Zemin's nephew, is the director of the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou. That single-handedly has kind of cleared so much of the kind of political mind space in which we all operate, even though we have no direct relationship to this guy. He's kind of, walks on clouds. Since it now turns out that she is essentially Jiang's protege, if that's not clear, it should be. His position is safe for the foreseeable, so that might argue that, and some of the people kind of in the coterie seem to be more from a kind of Shanghai cosmopolitan ideological background than a sort of more reactionary alternative. It argues that actually, there is still this perception of needing to be a global cultural player. I don't know. It would be an interesting thing to actually have to place a wager on.
Hello, I've been in the show in Guggenheim, and first congratulate. I think it's a great show.
Thank
you. I think what you said about the showing the censorship by the society is a great way of doing it. I don't know, maybe it's also very good marketing, and I don't know how much you were when you plan that this may happen.
Absolutely not, no.
Come on,
No.
US, you're American, you know about the animals and all these things. I think that at some point you could figure out. Anyhow.
Okay.
But again, congratulations to all the team, and the show I recommend to everyone because it's remarkable. And I would like to, if it's possible, you talk about the next 10 years of the UCCA and with the change. Besides the survival for another 10 years being a leading institution, could you tell us what would you more artistic goals you want to achieve thinking now that what you wanted to achieve when you look back 10 years from now?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. I really promise we didn't plan it. But no, it is a really special thing. So like I said in that little video, UCCA is a product of a really specific moment of kind of a lot of, and it's actually the link here with the Guggenheim show is, we end in 2008, and UCCA is very much a product of that moment just before 2008, where there's this massive amount of excitement, and it's not clear where it should all lead. And these 10 years have kind of shown us something about that. We were set up actually as a company, because at the time, that was the advice that Ullens was given, that there really is not a way to set up a foreign nonprofit. And as we've seen with the recent, kind of further restriction of foreign NGOs, it's probably was a wise piece of advice and a decision at the time. What's really exciting now is that from a governance perspective, we're no longer just belonging to one person. So at the level of the sort of stakeholders who have kind of taken over from Guy, there is actually a diversity. There's a number of people involved, and they will have sort of the corporate jurisdiction over the parent entity because it needs to remain, as an entity still a corporation, a company. But that in addition to that, we've added this other layer of a foundation, which because of legal reasons will need, and our own desire will be actually sort of accountable in different ways. And then there will be a board to that foundation that will sort of actually oversee the program, that will function more or less as the board of a museum would function. And in the mission of the foundation, there is to continue to do exhibitions. I mean, I think from Katie's little introduction, which is my standard bio, you see, there's this idea of kind of through art putting China in the context of the international and sort of vice versa. Like they're always sort of toggling back and forth and trying to see the one in relation to the other, and to contribute constructively to the development of an art scene in China by doing things like showing younger artists, by showing artists and showing artists in ways that would not otherwise be done. One thing that I'm particularly excited about is the chance to really deepen our commitment to research and to publishing. We're about to embark on an architectural renovation, so we're working with the OMA, actually with their office here in Hong Kong, to change the footprint of the physical space, to make it much more welcoming, much more visible from the street, but also to add a dedicated space for sort of research and reading, and to think much more about how we can function as sort of a portal into a larger situation in Beijing and a record of an artistic evolution that's happened throughout this whole period. So, in the past years, in my first 5-6 years in the job, we were functioning as much as possible like a public institution. So adding all kinds of things like patronage, a gala, corporate sponsorship, different kinds of projects. But in the end, we're kind of working towards one main metric, which was reduction of the resource drain on our founder specifically. This new situation allows us to kind of redefine those goals and actually think about, how to maximize the contribution. We can make the other element that I'm really excited about is just programs that will expand access and education for the community. And kind of with this new credentialing, we'll actually, for the first time, be able to welcome Chinese school groups, which was something like we could never actually do before. So that immediately opens up a whole range of possibilities and kind of implies a whole new level of commitment to the public that was not really there for us before. So, I mean, it's not just about making it financially self-sustaining or even about doing exhibitions that people in the art world think are great. It's about actually trying to change people's lives sort of through putting them in contact with contemporary art.
Yeah, I have a question about the Guggenheim show, like those removed artworks. So like we can argue that museum is a public space and it should respond to, criticisms from certain groups, like for example, animal activists. But how should a museum respond if what is at heart of those removed artworks, like what legitimizes them, like those animals, violence, and what if that is threatened or criticized? Like, how should a museum respond? Like, where does a museum stand in that sense?
So, I mean, the question of how much violence is done to animals is actually, to me, quite an interesting factual question, but that's not what you're asking, so that's not what I'll address. I'm particularly dismayed by the expectation or by the kind of assumption that for a museum to show something is to endorse morally and politically its content, right? I think that's really dangerous ground. You know, a museum is not a propaganda outfit. It's not showing things as models of, you know, singularly correct behavior. A museum is presenting objects that and images that open up new questions and new ways of thinking, and doing it in a way that's true to the intentions of the artists who made it. So I just, you know, and it's interesting because of course there was earlier this year this you know, a lot of conversation around a piece by Dana Schutz in the Whitney Biennial, which essentially came down to whether white artists had the power to appropriate, you know, an image of Black suffering, which is like a really huge aesthetic and political question, especially in this time and place. So it was really about, you know, who had the power to take something from someone else, right, and use it in this way. Whereas amazingly, like this incident is much more about a kind of unquestioned idea that, you know, a sort of set of moral and political assumptions that come very much from a particular strand of American culture should kind of apply universally and retroactively to artistic creation from a completely different time and place. It's actually the utter opposite of that situation, and in that way also quite disturbing. But I think, just back to my original point, there should be places in a society for ambiguity and for interrogation and for open thought and reflection.
Thanks for your lecture. Could you speak a little bit about the afterlife of exhibitions? Because I'm really excited about the one that you presented, but I'll definitely not get to see it in person. And
the catalog's better than the exhibition.
I was looking.
Yeah,
I was reading your essay in the catalog, and it's fantastic to have a record. But I've been thinking a lot about how much of artwork we consume through the reproductions of it now. So, if you could talk about afterlife of exhibitions, how you approach the project of the artwork that's being shown, and the book that you're making in sort of different ways.
I mean, well, of course, you sort of have to think about them separately, but in parallel. I mean, our philosophy for the book was to really focus on the object. So there's, 3 essays at the beginning from the curators, and there are 70 short essays about, it's a total of 156 works, I believe, by like 71 artists. So nearly half of the works got a specific entry that's something like 600 to 900 words. And then, you're into really specific stuff about catalog design and such. But of course, the book is not the only way it lives. But I don't know, I'm sort of hard pressed to think beyond like more traditional modes of documentation. I mean, sure, we had someone come in with like virtual reality camera setups and do kind of 3D documentation. But I think exhibitions sort of live on in the collective memory kind of more than anywhere else, right? I mean, we're still working through issues that were set up by, a show like Magicien de la Terre or China Avant-Garde in 1989, shows that I was certainly too young to see in person and have tried to understand through, combing the archives and looking at subsequent publications. But it's kind of one of the really interesting things about this field, right, is the way these things linger or don't.
Hi, over here. It seems that the UCCA was coming from a YBA type moment in China, and that at that time, I don't know if that's a fair definition of what originated UCCA, but I was wondering what is the impact that those artists are having in the current generation, and what is the current state of the contemporary art scene in China. And at the same time, a second question, a little bit linked to that, is the explosion of private collectors or private museums in Beijing and other places where seems to be a lot of money and there seems to be a lot of means. I'm not sure how your relationship to those is and how that is influencing the contemporary art scene as well, from maybe a different, more mercantilistic perspective, in my view. But what do you think about that?
I'm trying to parse. I mean, that it comes from, that UCCA comes from a YBA type moment in China. It's certainly a product of a moment when there was significant kind of international and to whatever extent kind of market complicit or market denominated excitement around the idea of contemporary art in China or from China, right? And obviously Mr. Ullens was an agent and of exactly that, as borne out by the many subsequent years over which the collection he had built and on which the institution was originally kind of premised was sold, often very publicly and at auction, and often at exactly the moment that the institution had kind of, because I didn't really get so deep into the history, but 4 or 5 years in, this, it's a gradual transformation, but basically 4 or 5 years in, we shifted gears and began to aim to act and function much more like a public institution than like a private institution, even if we were always, by virtue of our nature at that time going to remain private. And that meant trying to keep a little bit of autonomy from the market. So we were, just so people understand, we were, even after about 2008, the center was not really showing Guy's collection, and that wasn't its purpose. But I guess I'm talking about something different, which is just sort of how, as an institution, you relate to the market, because it's always quite fraught, right? I mean, when you do a show with an artist, it does a lot for their market and for their kind of the esteem in which they're held generally. And it's a kind of power that one has to really sort of not wield lightly, and one has to kind of understand the kinds of consequences of decisions, for those you show, for those you decide not to show, for the entire ecology. And I think we've spent a lot of time trying to think through those issues critically. And I think every institution does these days. And then I guess to your question about other collectors and other sort of sources of I don't know. I'm not exactly sure where. I mean, there are certainly a lot of other. There have been, UCCA is kind of the first of its kind in. After 2008, even after 2010, you started to see another wave of private museums in China. Many of them in Shanghai. Many of them still kind of in the sort of founder-led era at this moment. And I guess what I'll end by saying is just that it is really interesting, when you talk about private museums in the context of China, because of course in China, public museums are party museums, so they're actually not, public in the same sort of Enlightenment sense of a community, temple to knowledge where people come to learn and to think. They're rather generally, with some exceptions, places that convey an ideological position as convincingly and clearly as possible. Certainly in Beijing, that's the case. So somehow private museums it's like a prerequisite almost for being able to show certainly contemporary art in a way approaching the kinds of base assumptions that we make around institutional presentation and display in other parts of the world. So I always say it's almost a little bit like how in Chinese politics, left means right and right means left. So public doesn't actually mean public in that sense, and private doesn't necessarily mean, private in the sense of a treasure trove of a collector's collection. Okay, it's dinner time, I think, for people, and I don't want to keep people from their evening. Okay.
Hi, I'm Fabio Rossi, Programs Chair of the Hong Kong Art Gallery Association. First of all, I would like to thank Alice Mong and Asia Society for co-presenting this symposium, which coincides with the 5th annual Hong Kong Art Gallery Association Week. I would like to thank all the speakers in today's first session, Collectors' Visions Shaping the Art World. Dr. Weo gave us an inspiring and stimulating presentation and definitely expanded our horizon of what constitutes contemporary art. Liu Gang and Douglas So shared their experience in what was a lively discussion, I think. And thank you to Phil Tinari, for his exhaustive presentation, which helped us understand with greater clarity the history and evolution of Chinese contemporary art. A big thank to Marcel, Tammy, and all the rest of the team. They worked very hard to make this event possible, and the whole Art Week, in fact. Thank you all for coming today. I hope you enjoyed the program, and I encourage all of you to come tomorrow for what I'm sure will be a very stimulating day of talks, conversation, performance. We are kicking off at 9:30 with what promised to be a very entertaining Skype transmission by Steven Simchowitz, who is an agent provocateur in the art world. So please do come. And of course, join us for the rest of the week, next week, for all the other events, Art Walk, etc., South Island Art Day, Family Art Day. Please join us for cocktails now at Amo Terrace, where you will be also able to enjoy some screening of videos by artists from some of the galleries of the association. I believe you can enter the terrace from the door on my right, and there will be some volunteer leading you to the cocktail area. Thank you.